Bonnie McLeod, Marion Foster and Bob Langley return with a brand new series of Pebble Mill at 1. And that, of course, is in half an hour. Now, though, News Afternoon with Richard Whitmore and Moira Stewart.
Good afternoon. Who's out, who's in? Almost certainly we'll know within the next few hours when Mrs. Thatcher finally announces her long-awaited cabinet reshuffle. This morning, Mr. Pryor cancelled a visit to the Midlands and was one of several senior ministers summoned to Downing Street. And the other Monday headlines: at the Old Bailey, 17-year-old Marcus Sargent pleads guilty to firing blanks near the Queen. And the crew of a Royal Navy helicopter save a child from death in the mudflats of the Solent.
And also in today's programme, we talk to the BMA about the need for a new law to guard the secrets of the doctor's surgery. We hear of the inner city where husband and wife take separate holidays to guard against burglars. And there's another chance to see John McEnroe clinching his claim to be the world's #1.
It now seems certain that Mrs. Thatcher will announce her cabinet reshuffle early this evening. Downing Street was busy this morning with cabinet ministers being called to number 10 to be told by the Prime Minister whether they're to be moved or indeed to be dropped from the cabinet altogether. The Employment Secretary, Mr. James Pryor, about whose future there's been much speculation, cancelled a visit to Leicester today so that he could stay in London. Mr. Pryor was among the first to arrive at number 10 to see Mrs. Thatcher.
Prime Minister, but nothing to say at this stage.
Do you expect some later in the day?
Could be. I don't honestly know about that.
Do you know about your future yet, Mr. Prime?
Sorry, what?
Today is the day when we're going to find out about the changes.
Today, I would imagine it's today, yes. I can't be certain that it will be today. Well, I've seen her now, and I suspect I'll be coming to see her again, yes.
Has she told you about your future?
I'm not saying what she has done so far.
Are you still Employment Secretary, Mr. Prime?
I am at the moment, yes. I don't intend to do much work today.
Mr. Norman Tebbit, promoted by Mrs. Thatcher earlier this year, was also summoned this morning. He's Junior Minister at the Department of Industry, and his visit would seem to indicate he's being promoted. Lord Soames, who also went in, was among many of the members of Mrs. Thatcher's government to be consulted. David Howell, the Energy Minister, was also summoned. Brian Curtoys looks at what may be in store for him and his colleagues.
That procession of cabinet ministers who had their interviews with Mrs. Thatcher at number 10 this morning has at least given some clues over the reshuffle that we'll hear about in detail this evening. Mrs. Thatcher started work on her government changes over the weekend. She called in the Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Whitelaw, and the Government Chief Whip, Michael Jopling, for consultations. At the centre of it all, of course, is the future role of Mr. Pryor, one of the so-called leading wets in the Cabinet, a critic of Mrs. Thatcher's economic policy. And this morning at their 10-minute meeting, Mrs. Thatcher has been able to give Mr. Pryor her reply to his public signals that he doesn't want to be pushed off to the Northern Ireland office, that he would prefer to stay involved in a job concerned with the economy. And the fact that he may see Mrs. Thatcher again today seems to indicate that he may have been offered something else and is thinking it over. But if he is not satisfied, it could mean that Mrs. Thatcher might have a resignation on her hands. Of the other cabinet ministers who've been to Downing Street so far, 3 could be among the casualties. Energy Secretary David Howell, the Deputy Foreign Secretary Sir Ian Gilmore, he's another of the cabinet wets, and Lord Soames, the government's leader in the House of Lords. And another who might be in line for losing his job is the Education Secretary Mark Carlisle. One man who looks likely to get promotion is Industry Minister Norman Tebbit. Well, Mrs. Thatcher will be seeing other ministers during the day who are in line for promotion or demotion. The overall aim of the changes will be to strengthen the government, but MPs will be judging it especially on the way Mrs. Thatcher deals with her critics within the government.
Well, with most eyes fixed on the government reshuffle, the struggle for the deputy leadership of the Labour Party continues. After their debate at a fringe meeting of the Trades Union Congress at Blackpool last week, the 3, Tony Benn, John Silkin and Dennis Healy, will be meeting again on the Panorama programme on BBC1 this evening to continue their debate.
Meanwhile, the Liberals are gathering at Llandudno for the first of the party conferences. The main topic must be their growing alliance with the Social Democrats. Already, the Liberal executive have decided that to avoid protracted arguments over the selection of candidates, none should be chosen for at least 6 months, and that would give time for new joint selection arrangements to be drawn up.
A 17-year-old youth has admitted at the Old Bailey that he fired a volley of shots at the Queen. Marcus Sargent, with intent to alarm her. Marcus Sargent, unemployed and from Chapel Le Fern in Kent, was jailed for 5 years. He denied 3 other charges, and his pleas were accepted by the Crown. The incident occurred at the Trooping the Colour ceremony in June this year. The volley of shots was clearly heard. The Queen's Mount Burmese reared at the sound, but the Queen's skill as a horsewoman prevented it from bolting. Police rushed at a man in the crowd, Sargent, who was later charged with 4 offences, 3 under the Treason Act of 1842. At the time, Trooping the Colour proceeded as normal, although the Queen remained visibly shaken. Our reporter at the Old Bailey, Mike Mackay.
Because Sargent pleaded guilty to the main charge, the trial was over in an hour and was largely an attempt to explain and understand what drove this 17-year-old youth to shoot at and threaten the Queen. The Lord Chief Justice, Lord Lane, heard of a catalogue of failures in Sargent's life. He sensed that he had failed at school, followed by the blow to his esteem when he failed to make a career in the Royal Marines. According to his defence, Mr. John Matthew, QC, it was in this mood of frustration and failure that he wrote to one friend, "I'm going to stun and mystify the world with nothing more than a gun. I may, in one dramatic moment, become the most famous teenager in the world." In a letter sent to the Queen on the morning of the Trooping of the Colour on June the 13th, Sargent also said, "Your Majesty, don't go to the trooping today because there's an assassin waiting just outside." After his arrest, Sargent had agreed that the letter would have arrived too late to save the life of the Queen if the threat had been true. The court heard how, in the months leading up to the shooting, Sargent had become obsessed with assassinations. The death of John Lennon, the attempt on the life of President Reagan, and the murder many years earlier of President Kennedy. Mr. Matthews said, "He tells me he was very forcibly struck by the ease with which an unknown could become known all over the world, but he adamantly instructs me he had no intention of killing the Queen." He said Sargent insisted that he was not anti-royalist. In fact, he thought the Queen was a wonderful woman. He fired the blanks solely to draw attention to himself. Medical reports cited by Mr. Matthews spoke of his fantasies of omnipotence and his obsession with his lack of achievement in life and his sense of rejection. In a short statement read by Mr. Matthews, Sargent spoke of his respectable family and said, "I am a loyal British subject and I want nothing to do with anti-British movements." He apologised for what he called this stupid incident. But the judge, summing up, said, "I have no doubt that if you'd been able to obtain a real live gun, you would have tried to murder the Queen." He said that even firing the blanks at horses might have had appalling consequences. "You must be punished for the wicked thing you did," said Lord Lane, "and I therefore sentence you to 5 years in prison." The judge then commended a number of policemen, members of the public and a Scots Guard for their part in detaining Marcus Sargent. And now, back to Richard Whitmore.
Mike Mackay reporting from the Old Bailey. At Bow Street Magistrates Court, 7 Italians have been remanded in custody for a week. The 7 are wanted for questioning in Italy about armed robbery and terrorist offences. The court gave the Italian government 28 days in which to apply for their extradition. The 7 people were arrested in North London at the end of last week.
The American Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, returns to Washington today after his defence talks in West Germany with Chancellor Schmidt. He is expected to clarify remarks made yesterday in West Berlin suggesting Soviet bloc nations were involved in chemical warfare in Southeast Asia. Words which brought a prompt denial from the official Soviet news agency TASS, describing them as slanderous. Although Mr. Haig chose his words carefully, he implied evidence did exist.
Now, the international community has been alarmed by continuing reports that the Soviet Union and its allies have been using lethal chemical weapons in Laos, Kampuchea, and Afghanistan. We now have physical evidence from Southeast Asia, which has been analyzed and found to contain abnormally high levels of 3 potent mycotoxins, poisonous substances not indigenous to the region, which are highly toxic to man and to animals.
Meanwhile, NATO have begun holding their big annual autumn exercises in mainland Europe. In West Germany, 47,000 troops are involved. Most of them are West German, but Americans and Canadians are taking part as well. Outside Germany, the manoeuvres are going on from Norway to Turkey. It's only a few days since the Russians began their autumn exercises in the Baltic and across the border from Poland.
The Prime Minister of Norway, Dr. Gro Harlem Brundtland, was an early voter in today's general election. But if the opinion polls are anything to go by, she's going to lose. Dr. Brundtland has led the Labour Party since February. The Conservative, Mr. Kåre Willoch, could be the next Prime Minister if he can muster enough support for a coalition with other right-wing parties.
In China, there are fears of a disaster from flooding on the Yellow River. Urgent work is already underway to strengthen dams, and tens of thousands of people in the north-central provinces have been told to leave their homes and move to safety.
The South African Springboks rugby team has arrived in the United States amid fears that their visit could jeopardize the staging of the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. Several African countries have threatened to boycott the Games if the tour goes ahead. But, as Martin Bell reports, the American government is staying out of the row.
A sport little known and little played in this country is jeopardizing the 1984 Olympics. That's why the Mayor of Los Angeles, Mr. Tom Bradley, has asked the State Department to withdraw the visas of the visiting rugby tourists. But neither his appeal nor repeated lobbying by civil rights groups and some politicians has had any effect at all. The administration is standing by its position that it does not involve itself in the affairs of private sporting groups. It's a lot of fuss over a very secret tour. Supporters of the Games do not yet know where to go to watch them, or opponents where to go to demonstrate against them. Martin Bell, BBC, Washington.
And now that final of the men's US tennis singles in New York, when John McEnroe seemed to establish his superiority over Bjorn Borg once and for all. For Borg, it was his fourth American final and his fourth failure. McEnroe was playing in his third straight US title.
40-15.
Borg left the court without accepting the silver plate offered to the loser. A threat on his life had been made before the final began. In Norway, the Kenyan Henry Rono has set a new world record for the 5,000 metres. 13 minutes, 6.2 seconds. That's 2 seconds better than his old best time. And Britain's Paula Fudge set a new world record for the women's 5,000 metres at the same event. She was 10 seconds inside the previous best at 15 minutes, 14.51 seconds.
Well, social activities, sport included, aren't enjoyed as much as they could be in Britain's inner city areas. The reason, people are simply too terrified of crime to venture from their homes. A report out today says fear of robbery at home and mugging on the streets is destroying the old-fashioned neighbourly spirit in run-down inner-city areas. With it is going community social life. The authors of the report spent 2 years interviewing people in 4 areas of inner London, but their conclusions, they say, apply to all inner cities. Bill Hamilton reports.
Those entrusted with the job of trying to revitalise Britain's inner cities will draw little comfort from this latest report. The London research team found community life in housing schemes had disintegrated and that neighbourliness no longer existed. Almost everyone, they say, wanted to move away from their depressing surroundings.
I had expected to find the kind of working class image of society where the doors are open and there's tea on the brew. But instead of that, we found locked doors, multiple locks in some cases, Alsatian dogs to keep out strangers, and a society, in fact, in some ways, living in fear of its neighbours.
The report says that nearly 50% of those living in the inner cities have become socially isolated. They only leave their homes to go to work or for an essential visit to the shops or the post office. Few seem either willing or able to join in any activities, preferring to withdraw into their own separate world of home, television and immediate family. One woman talked of how she found her lifestyle.
Absolutely depressing and boring. There is nothing at all to look forward to. Nothing. You have to stay at home to watch your home, or if I don't stay, then my husband's got to stay. We've had holidays. We just finished a fortnight's holidays. I went away for a week. My husband stayed home. Because we just can't leave the place.
Why not?
Well, it'd be broken into. We'd lose everything we've got.
In some estates, tenants have started their own self-help schemes, relying only on part-time advisors. By sharing their problems and arranging their own activities, there's a general feeling that these residents have a stake in their own future. The report suggests most prefer this approach to being supervised by professional workers.
Undoubtedly so. Many people feel branded by the need to be treated by a professional. They feel inferior. They feel that someone's taking over their control of their lives, whereas most often people want to stand on their own feet and do things for themselves. But having said that, they must have the resources to do it.
The economic problems of the inner cities are well known. But whatever new initiatives are taken, the report makes it clear that restoring self-confidence could be the longest and most difficult job.
Your medical records and who sees them is a sensitive issue which occasionally surfaces when doctors' confidential notes are found in public places. It was only 10 days ago that half a ton of confidential reports was found on a rubbish tip in Leicestershire. There, details of tests on members of the royal family, on politicians, on actors and celebrities from all walks of life were mistakenly dumped instead of being incinerated. Such discoveries highlight a problem the British Medical Association have been concerned about for years. The BMA want a statutory data protection authority, and at a special conference tomorrow they'll be discussing the best ways of pressing the government to set it up. They believe wide protection is essential if they're to keep the trust of patients, but also to ensure that professionals can get access to detailed records necessary for many forms of research. One of the conference organisers is the man in charge of the BMA's ethical division. He's Dr. John Dawson. Now, Dr. Dawson, doctors, of course, have their own professional code, so why is there a need for a data protection authority, that's to say, protection by law?
Well, traditionally, information was gathered by a doctor and used by him working on a face-to-face basis with a patient. But that's changing now. Medical practice means that if we're going to get the best that we can out of the health service, we have to be able to share information more widely. For example, in the case of baby battering or non-accidental injury to children, the police may be involved in case conferences, social workers may be involved, and other groups of healthcare workers. We need a law that will allow us to share information for the patient's benefit with the security of knowing that the doctor who is responsible to the patient can guarantee confidentiality.
So that law would protect patients' things on, say, computers where most information is being stored now?
Yes, it's becoming almost irresistible to people who administer the health service and government to collect and store information on computers, and also increasingly to exchange information from one computer to another. And we want to make sure that information is gathered for one purpose and isn't used for other purposes without the consent of the person from whom it was gathered.
Is there a lot of evidence that it's easy to get this information at the moment from computers?
It's certainly easy to collect it onto computers, and once it's there, it can be very difficult to know what purpose it's being used for. And we would like to see legislation passed that would allow us to share it for research purposes, would allow us to use it as well as we can for patients, but will at the same time protect the patients. I think the problem we have is that the technology is, in some senses, running ahead of the morality that we have for dealing with it.
Well, you've got Timothy Raisin, who's the Minister of State at the Home Office, at least he is at the moment. I don't know where he'll be after the reshuffle. He's coming to speak to you tomorrow. What would you like to hear him say?
We would like him to say that the Home Office will produce proposals for legislation that would establish an independent data protection authority, that would create sanctions over people who have access to health information, so that doctors who collect information on behalf of their patients and other people, nurses, health visitors, can do so and can use that information for patient care with a security of feeling that they can pass information where it has to go for patient care, and that it will be respected by the people who handle it.
Yes. And penalties for those who misuse it, perhaps.
In the same way that if a doctor maliciously or frivolously discloses information, he can be struck off by the General Medical Council and lose his livelihood.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Dawson.
A Royal Navy search and rescue helicopter has winched a 6-year-old boy to safety after he'd been trapped in the mudflats at the edge of Southampton Water. At one stage, it was feared he might have been caught in the incoming tide. A BBC cameraman was aboard the helicopter and watched the rescue. This report by Nigel Farrell.
The Royal Navy's search and rescue helicopter from Lyon Solent was caught at the dangerous mudflats near Forley Power Station on the western side of Southampton Water. They were searching for a 6-year-old boy stuck up to his waist in thick mud with an incoming tide. The helicopter found him without trouble, and diver David Peel was winched down to pluck little Anthony Hargreaves to safety. The mudflats are less than a mile from Anthony's home, and he'd gone down there with a friend to get a view of a flying display by the Red Arrows. But safe on board an aircraft of a slightly different kind to the one he'd expected to see, Anthony got a reassuring hug and was quickly on his way to a waiting ambulance. But despite the cold and very smelly mud, Anthony was none the worse for his ordeal, and after a quick check-up by ambulance men, he was allowed home. And this morning, it's been back to school as usual.
The pound is down a little against the dollar, but sharply against other currencies. At noon, it was down 0.3 of a cent at $1.77.8 cents. The stock market was quiet, but slightly higher, and the Financial Times Index was up 1.5 at 554, 0.9.
Boat enthusiasts from all over the world will be visiting Southampton this week for the annual International Boat Show, which opens today, and Bruce Parker's been there.
There's no doubt that this is the shop window for the British boat building industry. There's no doubt that this is the crucial year for some of the exhibitors here. By the end of the week, it's hoped that orders will have been placed to the tune of £14 million. Boats ranging from small rubber dinghies costing just a couple of £100 to gin palaces at £250,000. And indeed, the first recorded sale here this morning, shortly after the show opened, was a yacht costing £155,000. That to an overseas buyer. But that does not tell the whole story of the industry at this time by any means. Behind the veneer of luxury afloat lies a good deal of pessimism for the future. Many boat-building firms regard this Southampton Boat Show, it's the biggest floating exhibition of its kind in the world, as a make-or-break occasion. Here on the south coast, it's been the worst year ever for redundancies and bankruptcies in the boat-building industry. Part of the blame, of course, is on the recession. But what killed Britain's motorcycle industry, what threatens the car industry, has now moved very firmly into boat building, competition from Japan. This is the 13th boat show at Southampton. They're hoping here that that figure has no unusual significance. For a good many of the visitors to this temporary floating town of glass fibre and highly polished timber, though, there are no thoughts of buying or selling. This is the stuff that dreams are made of. Back now to News Afternoon in London.
And right now it's coming up to 5 to 1.
That means that for boat enthusiasts and all others, it's time for the weather with Anne Purvis.
Good afternoon. Well, with this depression out to the west of the country coming across all parts, most of us will be seeing some rain and quite a lot of wind before the day is out, except perhaps the northeast of Scotland. It may remain dry up there until tonight. Now these fronts are carrying the bands of rain. This warm front carrying rain into western parts now, some of it heavy in places. It's working its way northeastwards, and the rain will be reaching the east coast by the early evening and the far north of Scotland by tonight. Now, in between the warm front and the cold front, there will be some drier weather around, but a lot of cloud and some mist and some drizzle as well. Now, the cold front represents another band of rain, and that'll be crossing the country during tonight. And tomorrow it'll be lying across northern and eastern parts of the country. So tomorrow's starting off with a fair amount of rain in the north and east, but then during the course of the day we'll be all getting into this sunny intervals and showery weather, and quite breezy, as you can see by those closely packed isobars. And then on Wednesday, well, all parts with sunny intervals and showers, but then this next system will be racing across the Atlantic, bringing further rain to western parts of the country sometime during Wednesday. But that's in the outlook. Let's have a look now at this morning's satellite picture. And there you can see this thick band of cloud that represents the warm front, some rain on it. You can just about see the cold front out to the west there. Eastern parts, as you can see, started off fairly bright this morning, but the whole system's moving eastwards, and it'll be bringing cloud and rain to those parts during the course of today. So if we have a look at the weather, well, these eastern parts starting off bright with some sunshine, but the band of rain that's over southwestern Scotland, much of Wales and the southwest, will be moving steadily eastwards during the course of the afternoon, perhaps the rain reaching this eastern coast by the early evening. The rain also will be getting up to the more central parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland as well. But we'll find southwestern parts of England and Wales becoming a little drier, but a lot of cloud and drizzle about in those areas. And as you can see, becoming quite breezy as well, with the southeasterly winds freshening up quite a bit. Now, northeastern Scotland should remain fairly dry and bright throughout much of the day. And then during tonight, well, rain for most parts of the country, but you find in these western parts it will be becoming drier by the morning. That's all from me. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Anne. Now, financial news, and here's Peter Day.
I said last Monday that autumn is often the time for upheavals to hit the foreign exchanges, and it certainly started early this year. First thing this morning, the Swedes devalued their krona by 10%. But who, even in the currency markets, cares about the Swedish krona? Few people except the Scandinavians. Nevertheless, it's a good example of how nervous these enormous markets have suddenly become. Last week, the pound fell faster than the autumn leaves, and the slide has continued this morning. The little changed exchange rate against the dollar is rather misleading, because sterling is down hard everywhere else, with its overall international value down once again to its lowest for 2 years. It's fallen 8% against the German mark in the past 3 weeks, which makes German holidays 8% more expensive. But what's bad news for holidaymakers is good news for British companies. For many months, they've been complaining that though the pound has fallen a quarter in value against the American dollar this year, it's remained extremely strong against European currencies. And those are the ones in which much of our export trade is done. Though a lower pound is desirable for exporters, it's giving the government a terrible headache, because it makes imports more expensive and tends to send inflation higher. You can't have it both ways.
Thank you, Peter. And now a summary of the news with subtitles. The Prime Minister is expected to announce her new cabinet later today. Some ministers have already been to 10 Downing Street to see her. Employment Minister James Pryor has caused the Prime Minister some difficulties by saying firmly that he'd prefer not to change ministries. The Liberal Party conference, which began today in Llandudno in Wales, will be discussing its new alliance with the Social Democrats. Their executive has already agreed to postpone the selection of its candidates for 6 months until discussions with the Social Democrats have been held. The American Secretary of State, General Haig, returns to the United States today after defense talks in West Germany. He is expected to clarify remarks he made yesterday in West Berlin, suggesting Soviet bloc nations were involved in chemical warfare in Southeast Asia. The young man who fired blank shots at the Queen during the Trooping the Colours ceremony this year has appeared in court. Marcus Sargent, who's 17, was jailed for 5 years at the Old Bailey under the 1842 Treason Act. A 6-year-old boy who was trapped up to his waist in mud flats near Southampton was rescued by helicopter last night. Last year, 2 of his brothers were also rescued when they were trapped in quicksands near their home in Hampshire.
And that's the news so far today, a day which all the pundits are saying is going to culminate in Mrs. Thatcher's widely anticipated reshuffle. Later programmes will be keeping in touch with any changing faces and changing jobs in or out of the Cabinet. Moira Stewart and myself hope we'll be here tomorrow. That's the News Afternoon.
Well, a further reminder that Panorama at 8:10 on BBC1 features the debate mentioned in News Afternoon between Tony Benn, Dennis Healy and John Silkin.